Hi and welcome to the Three Things I Know policy podcast from the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London. I'm Alex Mortimer, the Research Engagement Manager. Now, the school has over 170 members of academic, research and teaching staff across 4 departments and institutes. And at King's as a whole, we have one of the biggest concentrations of political scientists, political theorists, economists of various kinds in the UK. Now, we're divided into 4 departments. One of the departments here is the Department for European and International Studies. Dr. Russell Foster is Senior Lecturer in British and European Politics in that department. Hi, Russell, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Alex. Thanks very much for having me.
A pleasure. So tell us about your research interests and how they have developed over your career. And I kind of have a sneak advance peek, obviously. So I know they're very exciting and interdisciplinary and diverse. So tell me how all that has come about.
Yes, interdisciplinary. It's the great buzzword of academia, and yeah, I end up encompassing it. So let me see now. So I started my my academic career as an undergraduate back in the days before YouTube was invented. So back in 2003, and that was in history because I'd always had a great passion for history. And then over the next few years, as I developed my career, I ended up moving around. So at various points, I've been a historian, a geographer, a geopolitician, an international relations specialist, political scientist, and now I'm in the field of European studies. King's was actually one of the first to have a European studies department, and it's one of the last ones left now. So I've come from quite a variety of different backgrounds in the social sciences and the humanities, and that's really influenced my research interests. Now, I'm researching a number of different things which are related to identities and how we go about figuring out who we are and who we're not and why it matters. But really, I think that they all stem from back in the day, back in 2003, 2004, when I was a nervous 18-year-old undergraduate trying to figure out the role of history. And our professor at the time talked to us a great deal about how history is not just, it's not something that exists just in the pages of a book or on a TV screen. It's something that innately impacts the everyday lives that we live in. Our society didn't just pop into existence out of nowhere. It came from history. And he talked to us a great deal about the difference between, for want of a better word, big history and little history. German is one of those languages that's got a word for everything. They've got words that we just don't have. And there's a German term, Außenpolitik. Now, it technically means foreign affairs, international relations, that sort of the thing that, that the foreign secretary does. So technically it means that, but it's often used as a byword for big history or big politics. When we think about politics today, we think about presidents and prime ministers, ambassadors and the United Nations and wars and treaties. Okay, yeah, that's one element of it, but there's a whole other element that we don't really think about anywhere near as much. So if big politics and big history is Außenpolitik, I became fascinated all those years ago by the concept of Alltagsgeschichte. And I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, and my GCSE German teacher would be very angry with me. Apologies, Mrs. Wilson, if you're listening to this. And Alltagsgeschichte, it means sort of everyday history. And if we translate that, and remember, I've come from history, geography, politics, all over the place. If we translate that into politics, if big politics is the realm of presidents and prime ministers and state banquets, then little politics is more the realm of the chat that you have around the kitchen table. It's the feelings that you get when you see your national flag. It might be pride, it might be shame, it might be anger. It's the politics of the little everyday chats that you have in the kitchen. The politics of how much you're paying at the till when you're doing your weekly shopping. And I was fascinated by that, of how the little everyday histories can have a huge impact on our lives. And that's really shaping my approach to researching politics and Britain and Europe today. So a very rambling answer. I've got a lot of different interests. I'm looking at things like the legacy of the British Empire. I'm looking at Brexit and popular culture. I'm looking at the radical right and board games in teaching. It looks like they're all over the place and that I'm just doing completely unrelated things. But the thing that ties them all together, that red thread, as my PhD supervisor used to call it, that red thread is the politics of the everyday.
That's a fabulous answer. Thank you. So you're currently, in fact, researching pre and post Brexit British pop culture. Um, is that something you're working on at the moment? Can I ask
It
for some
is.
preliminary findings?
Absolutely. In fact, it was just about an hour before we started doing this. I got an email from what's it called now? Web of Science, the one that tells you when you've been cited somewhere, and you get a little dopamine boost when you get that email. I had just been cited in a law journal, which was looking into Brexit and pop culture, and I thought, hey, my research is actually being read by people. So yeah, so Brexit is a
Brilliant.
fantastic example of this division between big history or politics and little history or politics. So, Brexit hasn't completely faded into history, but we've all got tired of it, and we don't mean to keep raking over old graves. But it's a perfect example of this distinction. We've got the big Brexit issues, the Brexit Party, Nigel Farage, the Change UK attempt, second referendum, votes, all that sort of thing that were going on in Westminster. But think about the little everyday elements of Brexit. So I did my PhD on symbols of the European Union, the flag and the banknotes. And I used to do this little magic trick where I would tear up a banknote to show that it's just a piece of paper. And the only reason we consider it to be valuable is because of the symbols that are printed on it. I can't do that now because our banknotes are now made of plastic and I'm not going to carry scissors around with me. So I started applying this sort of little politics approach to Brexit because if we think about it, for example, with symbols, before the referendum, you would never see the EU flag in this country. I mean, you might see it on the hoarding for a construction site, something like if it's funded by the EU Regional Development Fund, something like that. You would just never see it. And then literally overnight, half of the country was flying the blue and gold of the European Union. We had people painting it on their face and marching down Westminster singing "Never Gonna Give You Up." And then we had the other half of the country, um, dusting off the Union Jack or the Cross of St. George. Now, this was partly influenced by the Scottish referendum back in 2014 when we saw symbols cropping up. And I became fascinated of how Brexit was becoming part of the everyday. And to our listeners who maybe weren't in this country at the time, I can assure you that between 2016 and 2020, you could not go 24 hours in this country without someone mentioning Brexit.
Mm.
There's a vote in Parliament, mention Brexit. There's a new president in the White House, mention Brexit. You can't find your car keys and you're late for work, blame it on Brexit.
Yeah.
It cropped up everywhere. And a place that it cropped up that I discovered was in popular culture, in fiction. So it started appearing in things that were, I think it first started appearing in 2016, in the summer of 2016 at the Edinburgh Festival, where there were plays about Brexit. Then we got Brexit the musical. Then we got Brexit appearing in video games, whereby you could make it, for example, it appeared in the Football Manager game in 2016, where Brexit could
Wow.
happen and make it unaffordable to buy players.
Oh,
It could
that's
happen
brilliant.
in yeah, it could happen in the mobile game Pandemic, where you play as a disease and you've got to wipe out the world. And if Brexit happens, then the British quarantine themselves and you lose the game. So it appeared in these weird places, and I think that's because it permeated our everyday lives so much.
Mm.
And so I started doing some work on Brexit in fiction.
Mm.
And there used to be this phenomenon 100 years ago, before the First World War, in Britain, when the British Empire was at its height and our pop culture 100 years ago was deeply paranoid and disturbed of believing we're at our height, but we're about to collapse because of not because of foreign threats, but because of internal traitors. It was called Imperial Gothic, this sort of gloomy, depressing late Victorian literature on the collapse of Britain. And I thought that we were starting to see that in a lot of the Brexit fiction. And that's what I wrote my first paper on. And I'm now contracted to write a book about this on Brexit and popular culture because it ended up everywhere. I mean, on my shelves, I've got rows and rows of books about novels about Brexit. Some of them are a bit tongue-in-cheek, some of them are parodies, like those old Enid Blyton or Ladybird parodies that you used to get at the tills
I
in
know the
WH
ones, yeah.
Smith's. You know the ones, yeah. Where the machine asks, do you want to also buy a chocolate orange and maybe a parody Brexit book? There's a Brexit cookbook, a Brexit fashion guide. There's all of these things. And without wanting to horrify our listeners, yes, unfortunately, there is Brexit pornography. It does
Good
exist.
grief.
Don't look it up. So I became fascinated on how this big thing, Brexit, the realm of prime ministers and presidents of the European Commission, how this giant element of big politics ended up
Mm,
filtering down to the little
mm,
everyday level. Now, there's been a similar uh, occurrence in the last couple of years. Now, the research that I was doing as a PhD was long before Brexit. And at the time in this country, nobody really cared about the EU. I mean, we weren't waving the EU flag, but equally we weren't burning it like we got in Athens or Barcelona. At the time, it was just the EU was just something there, and you would occasionally blame it if you were in a bad mood, but you never really thought about it. And then it
no.
became everything. We've had a similar thing. Before February 2022, nobody really thought about NATO. You wouldn't see NATO flags everywhere. Now, I know that this is audio only, you can't see, but here I've got my NATO
You've got a
coffee cup.
lovely NATO coffee mug. Fantastic.
It's
Yeah.
it's delightful. I use it when I'm doing video calls with people who I like to wind up. It's so we're seeing how these elements of big politics, whether it's the European Union, NATO, war, American politics, all of these things filter down to the everyday level. And because we are, how often do we encounter big politics? Maybe when you're watching the news or you're waiting for the kettle to boil and you're doom scrolling through your phone. Okay, you encounter it from time to time, more than our parents did, where they would only encounter it at the 6 o'clock evening news. But with little politics, we don't just encounter it a lot, we're living in it. It's
Yeah.
everywhere around us, and that influences us so much. So, yeah, that's how I've been working on Brexit and pop culture. And you'll be delighted to know that I've actually started working with the Museum of Brexit. There is such a thing, which is collecting all of these artifacts and little everyday things that show just how much Brexit permeated and will continue to permeate our national politics.
Right, that's fantastic. I will interject there because that's a really good point to sort of segue into part two. So I'm really interested in how, well, particularly actually, because I've got an archaeology background amongst other things.
Oh,
I'm really interested in the material culture aspect of this, how that kind of feeds into this whole Alltagsgeschichte sort of thing that we're talking about. So let's kind of put this into the context of policymakers working on the various challenges that they have. Now, some people I've talked to and I'm going to talk to in this podcast series work on quite specific policy topics, be it, they might work on environment issues, they might work on, it could be social housing, could be healthcare systems, could be a whole set of things. And your work is on these more, well, I'm going to say, maybe it's not quite the right word, I'm going to say more abstract questions to do with identities, shifting sort of everyday identities.
mhm.
How can we, and actually, of course, policymakers are also just citizens. I mean, we're talking about this amorphous lump of policymakers. They are people experiencing all these kinds of shifts around them and in their everyday lives that everyone else is. So I think we're agreed it's probably one big thing we know. We're kind of doing hedgehog rather than fox here. The one big thing is this thing about the big politics versus the everyday sort of history politics. How would you sort of distill that down into, I mean, not a recommendation, but what would you ask policymakers to keep in mind as they're going about making decisions?
I think that it's not something that policymakers need to necessarily do, but something that they need to be aware of on a constant basis, every waking second. Because exactly as you say, policymakers are just people like us. They're not superhuman. They're just ordinary people like you and me. And everyone is affected by the importance of identity and everyday politics. And that's something that politicians need to keep in mind. So my colleagues who are producing things like, policy recommendations on immigration or building those little nuclear power stations or, I don't know, cleaning up the waterways or reducing inflation, whatever. These sorts of things, fantastic. I can't do that. But what the people who are implementing these decisions, who are deciding whether or not to pursue them and implement them, they need to think that, yes, we've got this realm of quantifiable policy policy decisions, whether it's economics, environment, justice, foreign affairs, whatever, whether it's sending arms to Ukraine or deciding not to close bank accounts for politicians who you don't really like. Those sort of quantifiable things are, yeah, they're fine. That's what we expect policymakers to do. But politics is so much more than a single policy or a policy area which can be distilled down into a report, into a piece of policy advice. The realm of the everyday is hugely important. It is at least as important as the realm of big politics. Alltagsgeschichte is just as important, if not more important, than Außenpolitik. Because when people go to the ballot box, whether it's voting in voting in a general election or a local election or in a referendum or whatever, when people vote, they're not just influenced by, big policy decisions. They're influenced by how do they feel on that day? What is their emotional state? What identity do they have? And we've seen, I mean, it's a little bit reductive, I know, but an argument can be made that in recent decades, since the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, we've seen politics shifting from the politics of economic redistribution, sort of capitalism versus socialism, more towards a politics of feeling, of identity. In you know what academia's like, we've always got to have awkward words. It's what Nigel Thrift calls affect, the politics of belonging, of feeling, of emotions, of fear, anxiety, hope, these sorts of things. And identity is a huge part of that. Now, we could give a couple of examples of this to wrap things up, I suppose. One thing that I'm working on is the changing nature of the far right. So I had a paper with a colleague, Xander Kirk at Northumbria University last year, in which we were looking at the changing nature of the far right and its relationship with the LGBT community. Now, traditionally, the far right and the LGBT community have hated each other, and largely that is still the case today. They view each other as an existential threat. But what we found is that in this changing, very fluid environment in which politics and the everyday merge, we're finding that the far right end up sort of almost putting a comforting arm around the LGBT community to say, look, we used to hate you, but now we like you because we're going to protect you from new threats. So that is only one example of how identity is very, very fluid and flexible. So there's one thing that politicians need to do. We still think that identity is fixed, it's static, it doesn't change. It changes constantly and it has a huge effect on people. The final example I'll give you is going back to the European Union and the work that I did back in the day on my PhD on Europe and symbols and iconography. Back in about, I think it was back in about 2004. Yes, it was in 2004. There was a proposal. There was going to be a treaty to create a constitution for Europe. And it ended up being rejected by the French and the Dutch, and so it just never got off the ground. But one part of that treaty was going to be to have official symbols, to fix an identity, to create a sort of a national identity of being European, so that people wouldn't feel Swedish or Greek or Portuguese or even British, they would feel European. And I don't see this as part of some weird social engineering conspiracy. It was, just a well-meaning effort to get some symbols. It was shot down. And a white paper was commissioned for the government back then in 2004. And there was a fantastic quote in that white paper from the journalist Sam Leith, who was writing for the Telegraph back in 2004, who said, and now I don't agree with this quote, but I do agree with the sentiment of it, where he said, what we are seeing is a fantastic waste of resources and time, because you can manage taxes and subsidies and borders and industrial quotas. Yeah, fine. But you can't legislate the collective unconscious. And I think that that is something that politicians need to be aware of. Yeah, we can't control group identities, individual identities. We shouldn't attempt to control them. We can't legislate on them, but we need to be very aware of just how important these very dynamic, constantly changing identities and emotions and feelings are in shaping the politics of this country and the world.
I mean, you could certainly say, of course, I'm sure a lot of what you study involves looking at, well, areas in which, some politicians in some sections of politics are very, very good at understanding the moods of particular groups and, um, either working with them or supporting or sending out signals that they in some way support them. So it's interesting that I feel like people are definitely aware of this, but what I like about what you're saying is that there should be a sort of a systematic assumption across the board, and it's almost like a bias correction, isn't it?
It almost is.
Everybody working in politics needs to know that everybody is in fact responding from a set of, as you say, shifting identities all the time.
This is exactly it. And I think, I mean, this is applicable. This is not unique to Britain. You know, identity has been a part of every society. And, you know, until the day that the sun expands and consumes this planet, identity is going to be a core part of humans. But what we have got in Britain at the moment is still this hangover from Brexit. Do you remember, and our listeners will remember, long before Brexit, when politics in this country was boring, it was dull. You had a choice between the guy in the red tie or the guy in the blue tie, and you don't particularly care that much. What we saw with the Scottish independence referendum, with Brexit, is we got this phenomenon, to use a term from religious studies, of sacralisation, where it was no longer, oh, you've got a different opinion to me. All right, do you fancy a pint after work? It was, oh, you've got a different opinion to me? Heretic, you must burn. And so Britain is this uniquely sacralised, split out. I don't hesitate to use the word toxic. We got that toxicity over leave and remain. We've got that toxicity over obey the lockdown or not. We've now got that toxicity of, you know, should we be supporting Ukraine or saying, hey, it's not our problem, we need that money here. So Britain is a divided society. And these identity divides that transcend the old party loyalties, the old income and divisions like that. It's a very polarized society, and any politician of any party needs to be aware that they can't just appeal to their cohort, to their group. Exactly as you say, some politicians are incredibly good at appealing to their base. That's why they go into politics instead of going into other jobs. But the more you appeal to one group, the more you alienate the other side, because they're, you know, it's a polarized system. So if anyone wants to try and run this country, you've got to be aware of the enormous power of emotion and identity.
Mm. So you've talked actually throughout that kind of history of how things have recently panned out. We mentioned flags quite a lot. So let's
Yes.
come on to the fact of what the exciting thing that I know is about to happen, which is that you are going to go and take up a fellowship at Carleton University, Ottawa. And the reason I want to talk about that in the context of flags is there's another flag, also blue and yellow, that we have started suddenly seeing, that suddenly developed enormous salience and emotional meaning in the UK and elsewhere more recently than Brexit. So tell me about the fellowship and tell me about what you will be doing.
Absolutely. So I've been awarded a Konrad Adenauer Fellowship at Carleton University in Ottawa. I've never been to Ottawa. It looks fantastic. I booked my flights just a week ago, and I'm very excited for that. So Konrad Adenauer was the first chancellor of post-war West Germany, and he sought to rebuild Germany's reputation and rebuild Europe after the devastation of war, particularly as that was a time when there was a major threat to Europe in the form of the Soviet Union and the potential for nuclear conflict. What I'm going to be doing at Carleton is working on identity and legitimacy, but not just for the EU, not just for the British or the Canadians or the Americans, for the collective West. Because exactly as you say, this is something that has come up since February 2022. In January 2022, if you had gone out onto the street and asked the first person you saw to point out Ukraine on a map, they might struggle. I mean, I have a background in vexillology, in the study of flags, and even I, in January 2022, I would have thought, hang on, is that Ukraine? Is it Belarus? It could be Kazakhstan. And NATO, of course, has become much more significant since February 2022. No one really used to care about the EU that much before 2016. And then the day after the referendum, the most Googled question in this country was, what is the EU? Nobody really cared about NATO. Macron called it brain dead. Trump said it was pointless. We weren't really paying much into it. Now, all of a sudden, you know, I've got my NATO coffee cup here.
You've got your mug,
So,
yes.
exactly. So what I'm going to be doing in Carleton is working with policymakers, working with other specialists on identity to try and understand what it means to have a Western identity today. In the period of Brexit, 2016 onwards until the pandemic just overrode everything, We saw these questions coming up. What does it mean to be British, to be Scottish, English? Can you be English and European? Indeed, one of my PhD students is wrestling with a very complicated question of, was it possible to be English and British and European during the Brexit process? So we saw these things coming up. Since February 2022, we've now had the question, what does it mean to be Western? Because we get these questions. What's going to happen if Trump comes back in the next US election? Does Ukraine count as the West? I would argue, of course it does. But then this brings up the question of, well, where is the East? Where is Eastern Europe? Who is and is not Western? And by the same account, who should and should not be considered? Because we got these questions over Europe and Britain. Now we're getting them over the West. So I'm very excited to be working at Carleton University over the next few months to be taking these themes that I've been working on for the last 10, 15 years, taking these themes of the little everyday elements, the importance of identity, to see how people identify as Western and how, frankly, the West and NATO, and I make no apology for saying this, how they need to mobilize public opinion. This isn't like Brexit, where the threat was that we might have an economic downturn if we left the European Union. This threat is we might end up in a shooting war with the Russian Federation. This is not a war that can be won just on the battlefield. This is a war that needs to be won in hearts and minds. And if you think back to the last winter, when there were discussions of, oh, you know, we're going to freeze to death or starve to death, the front line of this war is not just in the Donbass. The front line of this war is in people's living rooms. It's in people's kitchens when they think, oh, well, I better not use the gas because it's going to be too expensive this winter. So mobilizing public opinion and public support for what it means to be Western. Yes, it could create problems in decades to come, but there aren't going to be those decades to come unless we do something about it now. So that's what I'm going to be working on.
That's fascinating. I mean, these are questions that really, well, I mean, it wouldn't be everyday politics if it didn't get into people's hearts in that way, would it? I mean, this is emotive stuff. Both
Absolutely.
listening to you talk about it is quite emotive. I mean, it's obviously that the stakes could, in the terms that you frame them, could not be higher. But there's even, I mean, you could even say there are longer term, even higher stakes, I guess, because the whole notion of being Western, we have to set that out, set that against, you know, in future decades, we will have to set that out in terms of world resources. And
Absolutely.
if you set an identity, do you end up suggesting that people identifying with that identity get certain resources which they have access to, and how do we manage that process? So
It's a tricky process. I mean, I'll end on one fantastic quote that I saw last year. I believe it was in the New Statesman. I always pronounce his name wrong, so if he ever listens to this, I apologise. The political theorist Bruno Mackay's, he made an argument that there's no shame in identifying as Western, because the West, in his phrase, the West is not a place and it is not a race. The West is a state of mind. The West is a belief in adherence to the rule of law, to democratic institutions, to progress in human rights. What's shameful and wrong about that? And that is something that we saw both sides arguing about over Brexit. We saw both sides arguing about it over the Scottish independence referendum or Catalonia, or even way back in the prehistoric times that we've all forgotten of Brexit and the discussion of Greece leaving the EU. You know, this is not something that's going to go away anytime soon. So I'll be delighted to work on this in Canada and then be back at King's College London for 2024, by which time there might have been a general election. So please don't change the Prime Minister too many times while I'm away.
we'll do our best. Thanks very, very much, Russell, for talking to me about all of this. Thank you very much for telling me the three things you know, which kind of turned out to be one very big amorphous thing, didn't it? With
It did.
enormous, wide applicability. So thank you very
And
much.
it was a real pleasure. Thank you, Alex.